In the cavernous, dust-choked silence of the Moretti mansion, federal agents found Don Vincenzo Moretti sitting in his high-backed leather chair, a glass of untouched amber liquor on the table beside him. There wasn't a mark on his body, no sign of struggle, no hint of poison. His eyes were open, fixed on some unseen horror in the middle distance, his face a frozen mask of absolute terror. He was dead. But that wasn't the most chilling discovery. The true mystery lay in who was missing. His 7 most loyal and brutal capos, the pillars of his criminal empire, men who were extensions of his own iron will, had vanished. Their cars were in the driveway, their homes were empty, their wives swore they had gone to a late-night meeting with the Don. They were simply gone, erased from the world as if they had never existed. The only clue left behind was a small, intricately carved wooden canary, clutched so tightly in Don Moretti's hand that his knuckles had turned bone white. The official story would later speak of a paranoid collapse, of a mob boss who finally succumbed to his own demons. But the whispers in the city's dark alleys told a different tale. They spoke of a tribute, a peace offering from a rival family that Vincenzo had accepted a year prior. They spoke of a young woman, a rival's youngest daughter, brought into his home as a living trophy. The question that haunted the underworld for decades, the one the authorities could never answer, was the one we will unravel today. How did the arrival of one silent, unassuming girl lead to the complete and utter disappearance of an entire mafia command structure and the death of its king? To understand how a man like Vincenzo Moretti could be dismantled, not by bullets or bombs, but by a whisper, we must go back 1 year to a tense meeting in the back room of a smoke-filled restaurant, where a desperate peace was being brokered and a terrible price was being demanded. It was a peace born of exhaustion, not desire. The war between the Moretti family and the Gallo family had bled the city's gutters red for 2 bloody years. Don Vincenzo Moretti, known as the Vulture for the way he picked over the bones of his enemies, had won. His rival, Don Alessandro Gallo, a man they called the Rooster for his flash and pride, was now humbled, his organization fractured, his best men in the ground. The terms of surrender were being dictated in the stale air of a neutral territory restaurant, the scent of garlic and dread thick enough to taste. Vincenzo, a mountain of a man in a tailored suit, watched Alessandro across the polished mahogany table. He didn't want money. He didn't want territory. He had already taken most of that. He wanted humiliation. He wanted a symbol of his total dominance, a daily reminder to Gallo and everyone else in the city of who held the power. He wanted a tribute, a practice as old and cruel as the Sicilian mountains their ancestors had left behind. He wanted Gallo's youngest daughter, Ilara. When the demand was made, a stunned silence fell over the room. Gallo's men bristled, their hands inching towards hidden steel. But Alessandro Gallo, his face pale and drawn, simply nodded. There was no argument, no plea. He just looked at Vincenzo with a hollowed-out expression and agreed. The ease of it was unsettling, even to Vincenzo's own men. A man who gives up his own blood so readily is either a coward or something far more dangerous. Vincenzo saw only the former. He saw a broken man making a final, pathetic concession. He saw a beautiful young girl who would serve as a decorative prisoner in his grand estate, a living testament to his victory. She would be a maid, a servant, a shadow in the halls of his power. He was so blinded by his arrogance, so convinced of Gallo's complete defeat, that he never once considered the true nature of the offering. He never asked himself the one question that would have saved him. Why was the Rooster so willing to place his most precious chick into the Vulture's nest? The deal was sealed. 2 days later, a black car pulled up the long, winding driveway of the Moretti estate. Ilara Gallo stepped out. She was not crying. She was not defiant. She carried a single, small suitcase and stood before the colossal oak doors of her new prison with an unnerving stillness. She was the tribute, and the clock on the Moretti Empire had just started ticking. Ilara Gallo was not what they expected. In the brutal, patriarchal theater of the mob, women were categorized into simple roles: wives, mothers, mistresses, or liabilities. They were meant to be passionate, loud, emotional creatures. Ilara was none of these things. She was quiet, not shy, but deliberately silent. She moved through the opulent Moretti mansion with a grace that was almost invisible, her footsteps making no sound on the marble floors. Her eyes, a shade of deep, contemplative grey, seemed to absorb everything. The patterns in the Persian rugs, the hierarchy of the household staff, the way the sunlight hit the dust motes dancing in the air of the Don's study. Vincenzo assigned her to the care of his wife, who saw her as little more than a high-born servant. Ilara was to assist with housekeeping, arranging flowers, and serving drinks when the Don held court in his cavernous sitting room. It was meant to be a daily degradation. But Ilara performed her duties with a serene, detached efficiency that was more unsettling than any outburst would have been. She never complained, she never wept, she simply watched. Vincenzo's two sons, Marco and Paolo, saw her differently. Marco, the heir apparent, was a younger version of his father. Brash, cruel, and dismissive, he saw Ilara as a spoil of war, another trophy to be toyed with. Paolo, the younger son, was quieter, more observant, and often overlooked. He saw the flicker of intelligence in Ilara's eyes and was intrigued by her silence, mistaking it for a vulnerability he could perhaps exploit. But Ilara offered nothing to either of them. She was a placid lake, reflecting their own intentions back at them while revealing nothing of the depths below. The Don himself would observe her from time to time, a smug satisfaction warming him. He saw her polishing his silver, her head bowed in submission, and he felt the thrill of absolute power. He had not just defeated his enemy, he had taken a piece of his rival's heart and turned it into a household ornament. He was a collector of beautiful, broken things, and Ilara Gallo was his prize acquisition. What he failed to see was that Ilara was not just watching, she was studying. She was learning the rhythm of the house, the intricate web of relationships, the spoken and unspoken rules that governed the Moretti machine. She saw the cook's resentment of the head butler. She saw the subtle fear in the eyes of the capos when they spoke to the Don. She saw the jealousy between the two brothers, a fissure that ran deep beneath the family's facade of unity. She was a cartographer, and this house, this family, was an uncharted, hostile continent she was methodically mapping, one silent observation at a time. And in that first week, as she arranged a bouquet of funereal lilies in the main hall, she noticed a detail so small, so insignificant, that no one else had ever paid it any mind. The Don's most trusted driver had a tell. Just before he was to deliver bad news, he would nervously tap the ring on his left pinky finger, a subconscious habit that broadcasted his anxiety. It was the first thread she isolated from the tapestry of the Moretti family, a tiny, insignificant piece of information. But Ilara knew that with enough threads, even the most formidable tapestry can be unraveled completely. The first test of her growing knowledge came not from a grand design, but from a simple domestic crisis. The mansion's head cook, a temperamental woman named Sophia, was in a quiet war with the Don's personal driver, a man named Leo, the very same man with the nervous tell. Leo had been skimming from the household budget for years, a minor sin the Don tolerated because Leo was otherwise loyal and discreet, but his pilfering made Sophia's life difficult, forcing her to account for missing funds and inferior ingredients. One afternoon, Ilara was in the kitchen, quietly polishing silverware, when Sophia began to curse under her breath about an upcoming banquet. Leo had once again shorted her on the funds for prime cuts of meat, and she feared the Don's wrath if the meal was anything less than perfect. Ilara, without looking up from her work, spoke in a low, measured voice. "The Don is meeting with the union boss at 5, she said. "He wants to appear powerful but generous. He will not be looking at the quality of the beef, but at the size of the portions. Serve the cuts you have, but make the plates look overflowing." She then added a final critical detail. "And when Leo arrives with the wine delivery this afternoon, mention that you saw Paolo, the younger son, looking over the household expense ledgers this morning. Mention it as if you are worried for him." Sophia, skeptical of the strange, quiet girl, had little to lose. She followed the advice. The banquet was a success. Don Moretti, focused on his negotiations, was pleased by the opulent display of abundance and praised Sophia's work. The next day, a terrified Leo, believing the studious Paolo was investigating his skimming, returned the full amount of the stolen budget money to the kitchen, claiming it was a supplier's error. Sophia looked at Ilara with a newfound sense of awe and fear. The girl had not threatened anyone. She had not raised her voice. She had simply nudged 2 pieces of information into place and watched the machine correct itself. News of this small miracle traveled through the household staff. Ilara became a silent confessor, a repository of the house's secrets. The maids told her of Marco's secret mistress. The gardeners told her of the loose fence panel at the back of the estate, used for illicit late-night departures. Each secret was a new thread. She began to use them, weaving a subtle web of influence. She would offer a quiet word of advice to a footman here, a piece of foreknowledge to a maid there. Her currency was information. Her method was the whisper. Her predictions, always rooted in her meticulous observations, began to seem like prophecy. She was no longer just the Gallo girl, the tribute. To the staff, she was becoming something else entirely. A ghost in the house, a silent power that saw everything. And while the Don and his sons were busy with the violent business of their empire, the true threat to their reign was polishing their silver, listening to the secrets they were too arrogant to believe she could ever understand, let alone use against them. The whispers that originated in the servants' quarters began to drift upstairs. Paolo, the younger, more perceptive son, was the first of the Moretti men to notice. He saw the subtle shift in the household's dynamics. He observed how the staff now moved with a quiet efficiency, how long-standing feuds seemed to resolve themselves overnight. And at the center of it all, he saw the silent, watchful figure of Ilara Gallo. Intrigued, he decided to test her. He was in charge of the family's numbers racket, a complex operation plagued by minor leaks and inefficiencies. One evening, he approached Ilara as she was tending to the withered plants in the conservatory. He spoke dismissively, as if her opinion were worthless, a common tactic to disarm. "The collectors on the south side are always short," he mused aloud, not looking at her. "3rd week in a row. Probably just bad luck." Ilara paused, her fingers tracing the edge of a dying leaf. "It is not luck," she said, her voice barely audible. "The collector, a man named Rico, visits his mother at St. Mary's Hospital every Tuesday at 4. His route takes him 2 blocks from the territory of a rival crew. His collection bag is heaviest then. He is loyal but careless. The rival crew is not." Paolo stared at her. He had spent weeks trying to identify the pattern, and she had just laid it bare with the certainty of a mathematician solving an equation. He didn't ask how she knew. The maids who cleaned Rico's apartment also worked in the mansion. He simply had the rival crew watched the following Tuesday. The interception happened exactly as she'd described. He plugged the leak, and his weekly profits soared. He reported the success to his father, taking full credit, but a seed of dependence on the quiet girl had been planted. He began to seek her out, presenting her with strategic problems as if they were abstract puzzles. Each time, Ilara would provide a solution, not as an order, but as a simple statement of fact, a logical conclusion drawn from the vast map of information she was building in her mind. Her influence was a poison administered in homeopathic doses, so subtle that the victim never detected it until it was already rewriting his cellular structure. Don Moretti, meanwhile, saw only the positive results. He saw his younger son, once considered weak and bookish, now demonstrating a surprising cunning. He attributed it to Paolo finally growing into the Moretti name, a testament to his own powerful bloodline. The Don's pride created a blind spot the size of a cathedral. He couldn't conceive that the source of his son's newfound brilliance was the silent girl he considered a piece of property. But Marco, the older son and heir, saw it differently. He saw his quiet brother suddenly outshining him, earning their father's praise, and he saw Paolo's frequent quiet conversations with the Gallo girl. Jealousy, a far more potent poison than any Ilara could concoct, began to curdle inside him. He started to view Ilara not as a trophy, but as a threat, a foreign element that was upsetting the delicate and brutal balance of power within his family. He just couldn't understand how she was doing it. Marco's jealousy was a predictable, brutish thing, and Ilara had anticipated it from the moment Paolo first sought her counsel. She knew that to truly dismantle the Moretti machine, she couldn't just advise one part of it. She had to gain access to its central operating system. That system was Don Vincenzo's study, the nerve center of his empire, where his ledgers, his plans, and his secrets were kept under lock and key. The Don's consigliere, a weary, aging man named Silvio, was the gatekeeper. Silvio had served the Moretti family for 40 years. He was loyal, but he was also tired. He had seen Vincenzo grow from a ruthless young lion into an arrogant and increasingly paranoid king. Silvio believed in the old ways, in honor and discretion, and he was privately disgusted by the Don's decision to take a rival's daughter as a tribute, seeing it as a vulgar and dishonorable act. Ilara began her silent work on Silvio. She didn't approach him directly. Instead, she made his life easier. She learned he suffered from terrible migraines and began leaving a specific blend of herbal tea on a table outside the study just before his headaches were likely to strike, something she deduced by tracking the high-pressure weather fronts he always complained about. She ensured the study was always the perfect temperature, that his preferred pen was always filled with fresh ink. These were small, invisible comforts, acts of service that no one else bothered to perform for the old man. One night, as Silvio worked late, rubbing his temples under the strain of the Don's increasingly erratic demands, Ilara entered the room to clear away an old coffee cup. He looked up at her, his eyes weary. "You see everything, don't you, child?" he asked, his voice raspy. Ilara simply met his gaze and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "I see a man who has given his life to a house that is beginning to forget his value," she replied softly. The words struck a chord deep within Silvio's soul. It was the truth he had been denying for years. In that moment of shared vulnerability, an unspoken alliance was formed. A week later, Silvio was tasked with reconciling the ledgers from 3 different rackets, a tedious all-night affair. He complained of his failing eyesight. Ilara, who was dusting a nearby bookshelf, offered to read the numbers aloud for him. Desperate, Silvio agreed. For hours, she sat across the desk from him, her low, steady voice reciting columns of figures, dates, and names. She was not just reading, she was absorbing, memorizing, downloading the entire financial architecture of the Moretti Empire into her own mind. She saw the inflated contracts, the ghost employees, the routes of the smuggling operations, the names of the bribed officials. It was all there. By sunrise, she possessed a more comprehensive understanding of the Don's business than perhaps anyone alive, save the Don himself. As she left the study, Silvio stopped her. "Why are you helping?" he whispered. Ilara paused at the door, her back to him. "My father did not send me here to be a servant," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He sent me here to be a surgeon." Silvio didn't fully understand, but a cold dread washed over him. He realized then that he had not just allowed a young woman to help him with his work, he had handed the scalpel to the one person with the will and the precision to cut the heart out of the Moretti family. With the intricate map of the Moretti Empire now committed to memory, Ilara transitioned from passive observer to active saboteur. Her campaign was not one of violence, but of chaos, orchestrated through whispers and meticulously planted seeds of doubt. She knew the strength of the Moretti family was its rigid hierarchy and the absolute loyalty demanded by the Don. To bring it down, she had to make the family doubt its own mind, to turn its strength into a self-devouring paranoia. Her first move was against a lucrative smuggling operation involving French silks, a favorite of Marco, the brutish older son. Ilara, through her network of household staff, learned the shipment schedules and the routes. Using Paolo as her unwitting mouthpiece, she fed him a piece of strategic insight. She told him that a rival family, the Falcones, were growing bold and that a show of force was needed. She suggested that a minor disruption to their port operations would send a message. What she didn't tell Paolo was that she had also sent an anonymous tip to a low-level customs agent, a man she knew from the ledgers was honest and ambitious, about a shipment of contraband textiles arriving at a specific pier at a specific time. She described the Moretti shipment, but named the Falcone family as the owners. The result was a chaotic masterpiece. The customs agents, expecting a small Falcone operation, raided the pier and stumbled upon Marco's massive silk smuggling ring. Marco's men, thinking they were being attacked by the Falcones, as Paolo had predicted, opened fire. A bloody shootout erupted on the docks. Marco lost the entire shipment, 2 of his best men were killed, and the port was swarming with federal agents, forcing a temporary shutdown of all Moretti activities in the area. The fallout in the Moretti mansion was volcanic. Marco, humiliated and furious, accused Paolo of deliberately orchestrating the disaster to make him look incompetent. Paolo, genuinely believing he had outmaneuvered the Falcones and that Marco's own men had botched the job, defended himself. Don Vincenzo, seeing his sons at each other's throats and his business in flames, bellowed at them both for their stupidity. The fissure of jealousy between the brothers cracked wide open into a chasm of outright hatred. No one suspected Ilara. She was in the background, quietly refilling water glasses, her face a mask of placid indifference. But inside, she was calculating her next move. She had successfully used one brother to cripple the other, all while making it look like the work of an external enemy and internal incompetence. The paranoia began to take root. Capos started giving each other sideways glances. Who had talked? Who had made the mistake? Trust, the currency of their world, began to devalue with alarming speed. Vincenzo Moretti, a man who had built his empire on fear and control, failed to realize that the greatest fear was now coming from within his own walls, whispered into existence by the tribute he thought he had broken. Hundreds of miles away, in a dimly lit office that smelled of stale cigar smoke and Chianti, Don Alessandro Gallo sat behind his desk, staring at a small, crudely carved wooden bird. It had arrived that morning, tucked into a newspaper, with no note. It was the signal. It had been 6 months since he had watched his daughter, Ilara, drive away to the Moretti estate, a day that had earned him the scorn of his own men and the derision of his enemies. They called him a coward, a man who had sold his own flesh and blood to save his skin. They did not understand the nature of the war they were fighting. Alessandro had known he could never beat Vincenzo Moretti with guns. The Vulture had too many men, too much money, too much brute force. Trying to fight him on his own terms was suicide. So he had chosen a different path, a desperate and terrible gambit conceived from the stories his own grandfather told of palace intrigue in old Sicily. He had decided to fight a plague with a virus, and his virus was Ilara. From the time she was a little girl, Alessandro knew his youngest daughter was different. She didn't play with dolls. She arranged them in complex strategic formations. She didn't listen to fairy tales. She read books on history and mathematics. She saw the world not as a series of chaotic events, but as a system of interconnected patterns, a machine whose levers could be pulled if one only knew where to find them. He had nurtured her talent in secret, hiring tutors who taught her logic, economics, and human psychology under the guise of a classical education. He knew her mind was a weapon far more devastating than 1,000 Tommy guns. Sending her to Moretti was the single most difficult decision of his life, a sacrifice that gnawed at his soul. He was placing his daughter, his brilliant, strange, wonderful daughter, into the belly of the beast. But he also knew it was the only way. She was the only one who could get close enough to study the monster's anatomy, to find its pressure points, to diagnose its hidden sicknesses, and turn them into a fatal disease. He had given Vincenzo Moretti the most valuable thing he possessed, and the vulture, in his gluttonous pride, had swallowed it whole, completely unaware that it was poison. The arrival of the wooden bird, the first of their prearranged signals, meant the primary phase was complete. Ilara had successfully infiltrated the system and begun her work. Now, Alessandro's role would begin. He started to subtly move his own pieces on the board, preparing his organization to absorb the territories and rackets that would soon crumble away from the rotting Moretti Empire. He began spreading quiet rumors among the other families, whispers that Vincenzo was growing unstable, that his sons were at war, that the foundation of the House of Moretti was cracking. He was preparing the narrative for its collapse, ensuring that when it fell, it would look like a natural implosion, not a demolition. The rooster was crowing, not with the pride his enemies mocked him for, but with the chilling certainty of a man who knows the dawn is coming, and that it will rise over the grave of his greatest foe. The paranoia Ilara had seeded within the Moretti family began to bloom like a black fungus, choking the air and poisoning every interaction. Don Moretti, once a man of decisive action, was now consumed by suspicion. He saw betrayal in every shadow, treachery in every loyal face. The disastrous dockside shootout had been followed by a series of other unlucky events, each one engineered by Ilara's invisible hand. A trusted police captain on their payroll was suddenly arrested on a corruption charge, the evidence delivered to Internal Affairs in an anonymous package. A warehouse full of untaxed liquor burned to the ground, the result of faulty wiring that a bribed inspector, now spooked, had suddenly decided to report. Each incident was small enough to be explained away as misfortune, but the pattern of failure was undeniable. The Moretti Empire was bleeding, and Vincenzo, unable to find an external enemy to blame, turned his wrath inward. The breaking point came during a weekly dinner with his top 7 capos. These were men who had been with him for decades, men who had killed for him, men whose loyalty was supposed to be absolute. But in the tense, silent dining room, Vincenzo saw only potential Judases. His gaze fell upon Benny, the Bull Gallo, a distant cousin of his rival Alessandro, a man who had sworn loyalty to Moretti 20 years ago and had proven it time and again. But now, in the Don's poisoned mind, his lineage was a mark of Cain. Ilara had subtly ensured that Benny's name was mentioned in connection to several of the recent failures. A whisper from a maid that she'd seen Benny speaking to a stranger near the burned-out warehouse, a suggestion from Paolo that Benny's collections had been inconsistently low. It was nothing concrete, just smoke, but Vincenzo was now ready to believe there was a fire. In the middle of the meal, he rose to his feet, his face purple with rage. He accused Benny of being a traitor, a spy for Alessandro Gallo. Benny, shocked and horrified, swore his loyalty on his mother's grave. But it was too late. The Don's paranoia demanded a sacrifice. He gestured to 2 of his other capos. "Take him downstairs," Vincenzo snarled. "Make him tell us what the rooster is planning." The other capos stared, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. To turn on one of their own, on a man as respected as Benny, based on nothing but the Don's increasingly volatile temper, was unthinkable. It violated every code they lived by, but no one dared to defy the order. They dragged a screaming, pleading Benny out of the room. He was never seen again. The act shattered the last vestiges of trust within the Moretti inner circle. The Capos left the mansion that night, not with fear of their Don, but with a new, cold terror of him. They now knew that their loyalty meant nothing, that years of service could be erased by a moment of baseless suspicion. They were no longer soldiers in an army. They were prisoners on death row, waiting for the Mad King to call their number. From an upstairs window, Ilara watched them leave, their shoulders slumped in defeat and dread. The foundation of the house was not just cracked, it had been pulverized. All that was left was to push. The execution of Benny the Bull sent a shockwave of terror and uncertainty through the Moretti organization. The remaining 6 Capos were now walking on eggshells, each man terrified he would be next. The trust that bound them together was gone, replaced by a frantic self-preservationist instinct. Ilara knew this was the moment of maximum vulnerability, the point at which the entire structure was ready to collapse under its own weight. She began the final phase of her plan, moving from sowing chaos to orchestrating a direct confrontation. She had to make Vincenzo see her, to finally recognize the true nature of the threat he had so casually invited into his home. She used Paolo, her unwitting pawn, one last time. She fed him a complex, brilliant strategy to corner the last remaining piece of the Gallo family's legitimate business, a textile import company. The plan was flawless, intricate, and required a deep understanding of international shipping laws, currency exchange, and corporate loopholes, an understanding a mob scion like Paolo could never possess. It was a strategy so sophisticated, so outside the realm of their usual strong-arm tactics, that it was like a signature she was deliberately leaving for the Don to find. As expected, Paolo presented the plan to his father. Vincenzo listened, his initial pride in his son's supposed genius slowly turning to suspicion. The strategy was too clean, too elegant. It didn't smell of the streets. It smelled of a lecture hall. The pieces finally clicked into place in his mind. Paolo's sudden brilliance, the household running with unnatural smoothness, the impossibly precise nature of the recent disasters that had befallen him. It all traced back to a single point of origin. A quiet, grey-eyed girl he had mistaken for a piece of furniture. That evening, Don Vincenzo did not go to dinner. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps to the conservatory, where Ilara was pruning roses, the thorns on their stems like tiny daggers. He stood behind her, his massive frame blocking the light. "The textile plan," he said, his voice a low growl. "Paolo is not that smart." Ilara didn't turn around. She calmly snipped a dead bloom from its stem. "No," she agreed, "he is not." In that moment, the veil dropped. Vincenzo looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and he did not see a defeated rival's daughter. He saw an architect of ruin. He saw the cold, calculating intelligence that had been methodically dismantling his life's work from the inside out. He saw the face of his own destruction. "Who are you?" he whispered, a tremor of genuine fear in his voice. Ilara finally turned to face him, her eyes as placid and impenetrable as ever. "I am the tribute," she said, "the one you took, but never bothered to understand." The rage returned to him then, a tidal wave of fury at his own blindness, at her audacity. He grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging into her skin like steel bands. He dragged her through the mansion, down to the cold, damp wine cellar, and threw her inside. He locked the heavy oak door, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing in the stone corridor. He had his serpent cornered, but what he didn't realize was that by locking her away, he hadn't trapped her at all. He had just severed his final link to the truth, leaving himself alone in the dark with the ghosts she had created. The final night of the Moretti Empire descended with the chilling stillness of a graveyard. Don Vincenzo Having locked Ilara in the cellar was a man besieged by his own mind. He paced his study like a caged animal, the silence of the grand mansion amplifying the frantic whispers of his paranoia. He was now certain he was surrounded by traitors, but with Ilara, the supposed puppet master, now in chains, he couldn't see the strings anymore. He was blind, isolated, and terrified. This was precisely what Ilara had planned. Her capture was not a defeat, it was the trigger for the final act. Before her confrontation with the Don, she had sent 2 sets of messages. The first was to her father, Don Gallo. It was a single coded phrase delivered by a laundry service girl who was on her payroll. "The vulture has caged the canary." This was the signal for Gallo's men, who had been waiting on high alert for weeks, to move into position, forming a silent, invisible perimeter around the Moretti estate. They were not there to attack. They were there to catch what fell. The second set of messages went to the 6 remaining Moretti capos. They were delivered by different, untraceable messengers. Each message was slightly different, tailored to the specific personality and grievances of the man receiving it. To the greedy capo, the message spoke of a secret stash of gold the Don was hiding, preparing to flee the country and leave them to take the fall. To the vengeful one, it hinted that the Don had discovered his disloyalty and that tonight was his last night of freedom. To all of them, the message was the same in its core directive. Vincenzo was unhinged. He was turning on everyone, and he had called a secret late-night meeting at the mansion to settle all accounts. The message named the other 5 capos as being part of a plot against him. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, turning each man against the others, convincing them that their only hope for survival was to get to the Don first. As the clock ticked past midnight, the capos began to arrive at the mansion, not as a unified force, but one by one, using side entrances and shadowy paths. They came not to protect their Don, but to confront him, to beg for their lives, or perhaps to end his. They were armed, they were terrified, and they were walking directly into a trap that Ilara had designed and her father's men were about to spring. Inside, Don Moretti heard the first car crunch on the gravel driveway. He assumed it was an assassin. He grabbed the pistol from his desk drawer, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was a king in a castle with no loyal soldiers left, about to be overrun by the very monsters he had created, each one lured there by a ghost in his cellar. The reckoning had begun. The events of that final hour unfolded not with the thunder of a gang war, but with the chilling, coordinated precision of an execution. As each of the 6 capos crept onto the Moretti estate, they found themselves not in a fortress, but in a hunting ground. Gallo's men, cloaked in the deep shadows of the manicured gardens, were waiting. They were not there for a firefight. Their orders, straight from Alessandro and designed by Ilara, were for silence and efficiency. The first capo, who tried to slip in through a rear kitchen door, was met by 2 men who emerged from the darkness like specters. A hand clamped over his mouth, a garrote wire pulled taut, and he was gone, dragged into the bushes without a sound. The second, attempting to scale a low garden wall, was pulled down from behind. The third, picking the lock on a side gate, was dispatched just as the mechanism clicked open. It was a silent, brutal harvest. One by one, the pillars of the Moretti Empire were dismantled and disappeared into the night. Inside his study, Don Vincenzo heard nothing. The house was soundproofed, a gilded cage he had built to keep the world out, but which now served only to insulate him in his terror. He sat behind his desk, pistol in hand, staring at the door, expecting a hail of bullets. But all he heard was the frantic beating of his own heart and the oppressive, heavy silence of his empty mansion. The silence was the true weapon, a psychological torment far more effective than any gun. It was the silence of abandonment, the silence of a tomb. After what felt like an eternity, the heavy oak door to the study creaked open. But it was not a gun-wielding traitor who stood there. It was Silvio, the old consigliere, his face ashen, and behind him stood Ilara, released from the cellar. She was calm, her dress slightly dusty, but her eyes were clear and steady. The Don stared at her, his mind struggling to comprehend. "They are all gone, Vincenzo," Silvio said, his voice trembling. "Everyone." Vincenzo looked from Silvio's terrified face to Ilara's serene one. The gun in his hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The betrayal hadn't come for him. It had been intercepted. The threats he had imagined had all been real, but they had also been neutralized. He was utterly, completely alone, saved only by the intervention of the very person he believed was his destroyer. He didn't understand. "Why?" he rasped, the single word a testament to his shattered reality. Ilara stepped into the room, her presence filling the void of power he had left. "Because a bullet is too quick," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of a death sentence. "And it is not my chosen weapon. I did not come here to kill you. I came here to show you that you are already dead. Your empire, your loyalty, your power, it was all a house of cards. And all it took," she said, pausing before him, "was a single breath to blow it all away." In that moment, Vincenzo Moretti understood true defeat. It wasn't the loss of money or men, it was the complete and total annihilation of his own legend, orchestrated by a silent girl he had viewed as less than human. A massive, crushing weight descended on his chest. His vision blurred, the room began to spin, and the last thing he saw was Ilara's impassive face as he slumped forward onto his desk. The vulture had not been killed by a rival. He had been psychologically dissected, piece by piece, until his own heart gave out from the sheer terror of the revelation. The cleanup was as methodical and silent as the takedown itself. Don Gallo's men, operating under Ilara's precise instructions, which had been relayed through Silvio, moved through the estate like ghosts. The bodies of the 6 capos were removed from the grounds, loaded into unmarked vans, and taken to a place from which they would never return. Every trace of the night's silent violence was erased. The gravel was raked, the disturbed soil in the garden was smoothed over, the locks that had been picked were replaced. By the time the sun began to rise, the Moretti mansion looked exactly as it always had, imposing, serene, and untouchable. The official story would be crafted with the same meticulous care. Silvio, the respected and long-serving consigliere, would be the one to discover the Don's body the next morning. He would tell the authorities that Vincenzo had died of a heart attack brought on by the immense stress of his position. As for the missing capos, a new narrative was already being woven into the fabric of the underworld. Don Alessandro Gallo, using his newly re-established influence, began spreading the rumor that the capos, sensing the Don's instability after the execution of Benny the Bull, had embezzled a fortune and fled the country, leaving their boss to his fate. It was a plausible story, one that fed into the existing whispers of the Moretti family's internal collapse. It explained everything while revealing nothing. The Moretti Empire, without a leader and without its command structure, crumbled within weeks. Its territories were quietly absorbed, its rackets taken over. Don Gallo, the man everyone had mocked as a coward, was suddenly the undisputed power in the city. He never celebrated his victory publicly. He simply consolidated his new position with a quiet, confident authority. And what of Ilara? She was gone before the first police car arrived. Silvio drove her to a pre-arranged location on the outskirts of the city where one of her father's cars was waiting. She slipped back into the shadows from whence she came, her role in the greatest power shift in the city's history completely erased. To the world, she remained a footnote, a forgotten tribute in a long, settled feud. No one ever connected the quiet Gallo girl with the silent, catastrophic fall of the House of Moretti. The legend was buried, the truth hidden beneath layers of plausible lies. She had walked into the vulture's nest as a sacrifice and walked out as its sole inheritor, leaving behind nothing but a dead king and a handful of ghosts. For 50 years, The story of Vincenzo Moretti's final night was nothing more than a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered by old gangsters in dark bars. The official record was clear: a mob boss dead from a heart attack, his top lieutenants having fled with the family fortune. The mystery was considered solved, the case closed. The grand Moretti mansion was sold, passed through a series of owners, each unaware of the silent, bloody history that had soaked into its foundations. Then, in the early 2000s, a young couple bought the estate, intent on a full renovation. They began stripping the old house down to its bones, peeling back layers of wallpaper and tearing up floorboards that had been sealed for decades. In what was once a modest bedroom on the 3rd floor, a room recorded in the original blueprints as servants' quarters, a carpenter pried up a loose floorboard near the window. Beneath it, nestled in the dark, dusty space between the joists, lay a small, rotting wooden box. Inside was not jewelry or money. It was something far more strange. The box contained a collection of small, intricately carved wooden birds, each one unique: a sparrow, a finch, a wren. And beside them, a stack of papers, yellowed with age but perfectly preserved in the dry, still air. They were not letters or diaries. They were charts, hand-drawn with an architect's precision. There were detailed maps of the mansion's grounds, schematics of the household staff's routines, and complex diagrams that looked like corporate flowcharts. But the names in the boxes were not of executives. They were the names of the Moretti capos. Arrows connected them, illustrating lines of communication, financial dependencies, and hidden rivalries. It was the complete organizational blueprint of a criminal empire, a document of stunning detail and breathtaking scope. It was a battle plan. On the final page was a list of 7 names, Benny and the 6 capos who had vanished. Beside each name was a single, chilling annotation, a psychological profile outlining their greatest fear: greed, pride, paranoia, obscurity. The evidence was proof of a ghost. It confirmed that the collapse of the most powerful crime family in the city's history was not an accident or an implosion. It was a demolition, planned with cold, terrifying intellect by someone who had lived inside its walls, someone who saw it all. The legend of the Gallo Girl was real. And so we are left with a final haunting question. What truly becomes of a world when its most brutal monsters are not brought down by bigger monsters, but by a mind that can see the darkness in their hearts and turn it against them? And how many other moments in history, attributed to chaos and chance, were in fact the work of a quiet, unseen hand, moving the pieces on a board that we never even knew existed?